Hello, welcome back to the David Watson podcast. Today I spoke with James, and James has written an interesting book on the history of war, but a particular type of war in a particular period of time, and about a particular gentleman. And I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, welcome to the David Watson podcast. Thank you for coming on. How are you?
Good, David. Thanks for having me. I look forward to our chat on my new book.
Yeah, could you just tell everybody the name of the book?
So the book is called Francisco American Revolutionary War. And it's about the last phase in which France and Spain delivered some vital help to the American rebels in their final victory at Yorktown.
And just how did you, before we get into the book Yorktown and the story themselves, and how did you get into studying this side of history?
So I was always a history enthusiast, but I've never been a historian or an author. I took a year off in between some work projects that I had about 10 years ago, and I ended up at the University of Seville doing a master's degree. And during that master's degree, I decided my dissertation was going to be on Francisco de Saavedra because I'd been reading up on the American Revolutionary War, and being Spanish and English, it's always good to address both sides of one's personality.
Yeah.
And this was a really interesting story.
No, I understand that because my mum is Irish and my dad is English, and my dad was in the British Army. So
okay, yes.
So like,
conflict.
Yeah, it's kind of a strange world you get born into, and
yes,
and it's one of those funny ones when people say like, "How do you feel about it?" Well, it just feels like growing up. I didn't know any different, and I think sometimes when people, if you're born dual national, people kind of think you have an opinion on it, and just like, oh, no, we kind of managed to live quite well in our house.
Yes, no, there's never been any conflict. You know, Spain and the UK still have Gibraltar to talk about, and that's sort of been put to bed at the moment. And actually, Gibraltar's in my book. You know, there was a long and bloody battle there too.
Yeah, because could you give people who are listening, just if you're able to, just a little background of the history? Because, like you said, it partly this is about how the Spanish come to the aid of the French, and kind of, I don't think people who listen, I often have a lot of American guests, and they don't actually kind of understand just how long Europe was at war for, and for how many centuries, with all these monarchs just falling out of each other.
Yeah, well, I won't go back too long, but I'll go back to the beginning of the 18th century. 1704 is the War of Spanish Succession, in which Spain gets a new dynasty because the French Bourbons, the Bourbon dynasty, was successful, and a new Bourbon king was established, and that is the dynasty that still rules today. So there were two branches of the Bourbon family. One became established in Spain, and throughout, and obviously the French one continued until the French Revolution. So throughout what they call the long 18th century, France and Spain were joined at the hip through three Bourbon alliances called family compacts, which essentially was an alliance to fend off principally the United Kingdom, and secondly, the Austrian Habsburg Empire, which was another rival in continental Europe.
So, and then how does that proceed? What follows?
So there are several wars throughout the 18th century, but I'll go back to the one prior to the American Revolutionary War, which is the 7 Years' War, which was principally fought in North America, and which involved French colonies and the British colonies. It was about supremacy as to who was going to prevail in North America. And Spain obviously also had a huge amount of sway in the southern parts of the United States, from California to Florida. These were all Spanish dominions. The Spanish also had dominions in the Caribbean, Cuba, and many of the other islands. Also, France and the UK. The UK had Jamaica. The French had Saint Domingue. They were all very wealthy sugar islands, sugar producing islands, which actually produced more tax revenue for the UK, for example, than North America did. So, as part of this American Revolutionary War, there was a huge amount of military activity in the Caribbean.
So, how did it get to, or what started the Revolutionary War?
So, at the end of the Seven Years' War, Britain had won and France had relinquished its North American uh, posts and huge land area, all inland along the Mississippi, all the way up to Canada. And east of the Mississippi, what had been French dominions, was passed over to the British, and west of the Mississippi was passed over to Spain. Now, this was all fine, but they were huge areas which were difficult to defend. So Britain's military spending went up, and they wanted to tax the North American colonists for housing, extra men and garrisons in North America, which led to the Boston Tea Party, which was all about taxes on tea.
Yeah, because that's a good point, is it? Because people, I don't think, like you say, when the name like Boston Tea Party comes up, but people don't always understand what these things were about, and that whilst we obviously most attention when it comes to war is about the bloody and gruesome side of it and the loss of life. Probably the biggest part of war that's unspoken is the finances, and where the finances come in, how people countries, while it appears they're dominating, are often taxing, borrowing, and stealing.
Yes. Yes, I mean, as we know, in the current war in Ukraine, without money, Ukraine doesn't survive. So that's been the big background issue, who's backing Ukraine. And equally, at the time in the 18th century, Britain did attempt to put new taxes on the North American colonists to finance its defences, because all the major European powers, and I'm talking here about the Atlantic powers, France, Britain, Spain, had colonies abroad, and they all taxed wherever they could, and also built up, as the century went on, their navies, which were very costly to maintain, to be ready for the next round. I mean, it was really not until the French Revolution that France kind of fell out of the empire game in the North Atlantic. Well, it relinquished most of its colonies during the 7 Years' War before the American Revolution. But the American Revolution, the French aim was to weaken the British just as much as they were wanting to create a greater role for France to have commerce with North America. It was all about weakening Britain.
And again, it's a strange thing with history, where sometimes these decisions are not about winning. It's about draining the resources of your opponent, and it kind of slaps in the face of what we're taught, because everybody just kind of, it's somebody charging down the battlefield, best man wins, and often that's kind of the smallest part of the war. They're significant battles, but the winning and losing is often decided by the banker's draft.
Well, exactly, and one of the principles of the French foreign de Vergennes at the time was that he was always worried that the British would meddle in Europe and create problems on the eastern side of France's frontiers by allying itself with Russia or Prussia. So they wanted to distract Britain in North America just as much as make or recover some of the influence that they'd had previously in North America themselves.
So where does your book start?
So my book starts, it's a long war. The war starts in 1775. The Americans have an initial success. They push the British out of Boston. Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775. The British evacuate Boston in early 1776. Then there's a battle called the Battle of Trenton, which Washington avoids being defeated at the end of 1776. And then we have the key battle that brought the French in, the Battle of Saratoga, where an invading force of British troops come down from Canada but are wiped out by American forces in the hinterlands, let's say, of the northeast coast. So this is the background. Beyond that, 1777, we have a sort of a situation where no one is prevailing. And this carries on really until 1781. And during that time, a lot of that time, George Washington is opposite the main garrison held by the British in New York, shadowing them, making sure they don't make any inroads into the land. The British are supplied from the sea. They also control some towns to the south, like Savannah and Charleston. But basically, the British dominate the sea with their navy, and they have these well-held garrisons. But no one's got any serious advantage over the other. The Americans were handicapped by a lack of money. The soldiery was ill-equipped, and they didn't really prevail in any sense, except they didn't allow the British to make big inroads into the hinterland of North America. So it was a stalemate until 1781.
And is this where Francisco comes in?
Exactly. So Francisco de Saavedra is part of the Spanish Minister of the Indies strategy for the Caribbean. Spain, when it came in to help France, France declares war against the British in North America in early 1778. They then panic because they see that they're to fend off the British Navy. And so for the next 9 months until June 1779, they bargain with the Spanish to enter the war alongside the French, because the Spanish and French navies combined could put together about 120 ships of the line, the largest battleships available at that time, and the British would have around 90. Quantitatively, the Royal Navy was better, but as Stalin used to say, quantity has its own quality. So the amount of ships that the Spanish and French could put together was the trump card in changing the course of the war in North America, because British lost control of the sea. And that, when you lose control of the sea and the sea lanes, you lose control of the Caribbean, your convoys get captured, and lots of hazards appear.
And this was, I mean, this was a huge blow for the British, because one of the things they were always famous for, along with the Spanish, to be fair, was their navy. It was, and again, I think it's one of those things that people don't understand, that back then, I suppose Portugal's in that as well. But
Portugal was in it, let's say sentimentally, but just before Spain joined the war, they had sent an expedition down to Brazil and browbeaten the Portuguese into not doing very much by taking some of their southern parts of Brazil. So they weren't in a good position and actually didn't contribute militarily to anything.
So by this time, then the bragging rights for the sea is just between the Spanish and the British.
Exactly, Spanish and French combined, and the British. Yeah.
I never knew the Spanish and the French had combined. I never.
Yes.
Knew.
So the French had about a navy of around 60, 65 ships to the line, and the Spanish put in around 55, 60 ships. So it took them to quite a nice number. So what happens in this situation is that the British Navy is spread out. It's manning and blockading the North American coast to make sure that American privateers working for the rebels don't get too much help coming in. So it's trying to blockade any help coming from the sea, which it's a leaky blockade. It doesn't really work perfectly. And at the same time, it's trying to stop the British and the French battling for islands in the Caribbean, the valuable sugar islands. And one last part of this, let's say, setup is that when Spain came in 1779, they immediately started a land siege of Gibraltar with a land army, but also a naval blockade. So the British had to keep Gibraltar supplied, keep hold of their Caribbean islands, and patrol the North American coast. So their navy was split all over the place. And what this allowed was the Spanish and French to send fleets and armies and supplies to the Caribbean, which were then used to help the North Americans.
Because that's, I think, one of the things that is the disadvantage of when countries go out and start building empires. You rely on reputation to stop people attacking you.
Yes.
Because, like you say, you can be the most resourced navy or army in the world, but if you're spread across continents, you become quite weak.
Exactly. The Spanish also had another advantage in that their main fortress island, or let's say city, which was Havana in Cuba, was very well supplied with silver. And this is the money part of the book that I addressed. The silver came from the silver mines in Mexico, in Zacatecas in Mexico, which was about a 2-week sailing trip from Mexico, and so they also had a very full-on naval yard in Havana. So this allowed them to operate quite with a lot of resilience from this base. The British main base was in Jamaica, but that wasn't really close to the action. The one they used most was in Antigua, and they didn't really have anything but a small repair yard. There wasn't the full service shipyard which built and repaired ships.
I didn't know, yeah. So again, it's this thing, and this is all new to me. So this is the side of the history I didn't, I know nothing about. And like you say, there's a significant advantage if you own the silver mine. You can literally generate your own income. Just
Yeah. So at the time, the silver peso was what's being called as the first global currency. It was called the Real de Ocho, or in English, the piece of 8. It was also called the dollar. So this silver was very valued by European powers because a lot of other powers didn't have silver. They might have had gold. But the problem with gold is that, for example, Britain, what it wanted to do with the silver was trade with China. And China, by law, would only accept payments in silver. So this is the global element of the finance. So these silver mines were just a printing machine for Spain, which provided them with the competitive advantage in money to do what they liked. Because in North America, when the rebels rebelled, North America didn't have much specie, as it's called, silver coins. And so they were really trading with IOUs and letters of credit, which is not so immediately attractive to someone who's abroad and you're trying to pay for weapons. So, the Spanish silver dollar, which was actually legal as legal tender in the United States until 1857, played a huge role because Saavedra provided silver dollars. And what this made attractive to the French campaign in North America is that when you pay a farmer for your supplies in silver dollars, they bring you the goods. If the farmer in North America even hears that even it's the Continental American Army coming down, who are just going to requisition all your food that you've just taken years to produce and all your stores, they would often hide it because they would be paid in paper dollars, which became worthless as time went by.
Well, because this is at that transition of money as well, isn't it? Where we're still in an era where money, the value of money is because of the metal it's made from.
Yes.
And whereas, like you say, when paper dollars come in, it's, I mean, I think it's in God we trust, or we trust the bearer to pay. They're more, they're glorified IOU notes, really.
That's what it was. Basically, at the beginning when they launched the silver dollar as a bill, as an IOU, they would be issued in notes, and they were first issued as 1-to-1, i.e., the continental. So the individual dollar notes went down from 1-to-1 to 12,000-to-1. It was a huge devaluation. So silver dollars were the name of the game.
And I just want to give people some context, which you can correct me on as well if I get this wrong. But by today's standard, because people can just print paper money, it devalues the currency. Whereas if you're digging silver, well, that's fine, because silver is still a real commodity, and I've got it in my hand, and it's of value to other people. So the value of that silver piece doesn't go down, which is kind of how old money worked.
Exactly. And Britain came off the gold standard after the First World War. The American came off the silver standard in the 1960s during the American intervention in Vietnam. And since then, it's been what they call fiat money. You have to trust the bill.
Yeah. And how's that working out for us all?
Not too well.
No. So tell us more about Francisco.
So he was a doctor in theology, age 16, but he didn't go into the church. He joined the army, and he had early experience shortly before the American War of Independence started with a military campaign against Algiers, in which he was aide-de-camp to a Spanish general of Irish origin called O'Reilly, and he was involved in trying to browbeat the Algerian Bey, which was a pirate state under the vassalage of the Ottoman Empire. It didn't go very well, but it brought him a huge amount of experience in amphibious operations. And he was involved in the action on a beachhead. The Spanish were defeated. They had to leave. And soon after that, he came across one of the Spanish heroes of this American Revolutionary War, Bernardo de Galvez, and he was key. His uncle became, soon after they met, the minister for the Indies, the minister in charge of all the colonies, and he was all-powerful. So as the war clouds gathered in North America, the uncle, who was called Jose de Galvez, sent Bernardo de Galvez to Louisiana as governor. And he was intent on retaking the Spanish possessions which had been taken by the British during the 7 Years' War along the Gulf of Mexico, Pensacola and East and West Florida. Now, Bernardo de Galvez was very, very aggressive, but also very young, and generated a lot of jealousy amongst other commanders in Havana. So Minister Galvez, who had by that time employed Saavedra in his ministry as a senior secretary, looked for a volunteer to be sent to Havana to put all the jealous generals in line to help his nephew. So Saavedra was sent out to Havana as a royal commissioner, sent by the king with huge powers, almost the powers of a of a war minister in the Caribbean, powers to requisition money in Mexico, powers to deal with the Spanish generals, powers to deal with the French generals. And it's in this logistical senior liaison officer role that Saavedra excelled in, first of all, lining up the entire Havana War Council to back his nephew, the minister's nephew, Bernardo, in Pensacola, and then to go and negotiate with the French fleets and the admirals that were being sent out to the Caribbean to campaign not only in the Caribbean and win islands off the British, but also to go and help the North American rebels. So Saavedra occupies a niche in which the Spanish retake Florida, which is a small but important victory in eliminating the British threat from the southern side of the United States to the 13 colonies. And then he goes and negotiates with the French. The French fleet was Admiral de Grasse's fleet, which had been sent to, first of all, retake some sugar islands and create positions of control. And also, when you take someone's island and they want it back, when there's an eventual peace negotiation, the more you've nicked off your neighbor, the more you can negotiate and trade away in the peace negotiation. But concretely, what happened was Pensacola was in May 1781. So this is the key year that I saw that Saavedra was very important. He arrives in Havana in January 1781, puts together the campaign that enables the Spanish to take Pensacola, doubles the amount of troops available to Bernardo de Galvez, makes the Navy go and do it, they were all reluctant to help this young aggressive general who everyone viewed was being helped by his uncle in Madrid. So that's put together, and soon after he gets a letter from Madrid saying, now you've got to go to Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue is now called Haiti. It was the Caribbean's most productive sugar colony. It had 300,000 to 400,000 slaves and 30,000 whites and mixed race people, all dedicated to the production of sugar. And this is where the French fleet was based, and which is where its commerce convoys would gather to sail back to France with the goodies. So in March 1781, de Grasse leaves France. He arrives shortly after in Saint-Domingue. Saavedra goes to meet him, and they have a meeting in early to mid-July 1781 where they draw up what's called the de Grasse-Saavedra Convention, which is basically a campaign agreement for the next 9 months, which describes how the Spanish will help the French sail to North America after the campaign season is over in the summer. You must remember the fleets didn't stay in the Caribbean during the summer. It's hurricane season. So the advantage or the plan was to leave the Caribbean during the hurricane season so they didn't have the fleet smashed up in a hurricane, go to North America, and then the fleet will come back and they will campaign again in the Caribbean in late winter, early spring 1782. So what happens in Saint-Domingue is that the French have got a large fleet, around 28 ships of the line, but they don't have any money. So Saavedra volunteers to go to Havana to get 500,000 silver pesos. A peso is an ounce of silver. It's a huge amount of money. And the French wouldn't have been able to leave or campaign in North America. You've got to remember that a fleet of 28 ships of the line, plus smaller ships, it's around 20 to 30,000 men. You've got to feed them. So it's a huge city. Each ship of the line has between 700 to 1,000 men, depending on its size. And they're going to sail to the Chesapeake, to Yorktown. De Grasse decides he's not going to go to New York, which is where George Washington wanted to campaign, because there's a problem in New York. There's a sandbar, and the French fleets can't get over the sandbar. Their draft is too deep. So he chooses to go to Chesapeake Bay, where they've heard that General Cornwallis is creating a lot of problems with an army of around 5,000 to 7,000 men, and that he's got set himself up in a place called Yorktown near the mouth of Chesapeake Bay, going out to sea. So what happens is that these 28 ships of the line go to North America and create a temporal superiority which blockades Cornwallis, and he can't escape. At the same time, George Washington and a French army which had been helping opposite New York, they marched south and seal off Cornwallis from the land side. So it's called the Battle of Yorktown, more like a siege. They were sealed off and they had to capitulate after about a 3 or 4 week artillery bombardment and a few infantry charges. The French fleet sees off a British fleet that comes to the rescue, but the British fleet with 19 ships of the line is not enough to challenge the French, who eventually accumulate 36 ships of the line because another small squadron arrives to join de Grasse. So that loss of the sea is crucial to the American victory at Yorktown. And not only that, the French Navy brings a small army of 3,500 men to join the troops that have marched down from New York, and also the money to survive during that time and to have plenty of supplies available to the Navy and the Army on land. So the lack of specie was a huge issue during this campaign. The Americans were expecting new money to come, and does arrive, but it arrives in November, and it's way after the battle is finished, which is the 19th of October. So the Spanish money from Havana was crucial to the victory.
And that's the thing, is the battle is over in October. The money rise up in November, which again highlights the problems with communication and time. So much was done in good faith.
Yes. So what happens is that the money that came from France arrives in November, but on the way up from Saint-Domingue, de Grasse and his fleet stopped off Havana, brought on board the Spanish silver pesos, which they sail up to Chesapeake Bay with, and that's offloaded off the ships on around the 17th of September, and finances the campaign for the duration of the campaign until the British surrender.
Do we know much about what Francisco was doing as a child? Because you said he studied theology but didn't join the church. Do we know anything about that?
Yeah, well, he left some memoirs and diaries, and he was born in Seville. He went to study in Granada, and which is where he graduated in theology at the young age of 16. He then went and tried to join the church, but failed to get a canonry in the cathedral in Cadiz. And failing that, he decided he was going to go and speculate and try and do the circles of patronage in Madrid. And while he's in Madrid and failing to get employment within the church, one night he goes out carousing with one of his friends. And as a result of this carousing, the neighbors report them, and they get arrested by some soldiers from a regiment that was stationed nearby, that was called the Immemorial del Rey, the Immemorial Regiment of the King, run by the Count of Fernand Nunez. What happens there is quite curious. He ingratiates himself to such an extent with the officers of this regiment that the Count of Fernand Nunez offers him a commission in the army. And that's how his army career takes off. And then he's in the patronage circles of the army in Madrid, and how he eventually meets Bernardo de Galvez and his uncle minister of the Indies, Jose de Galvez.
See, this is what's missing with the modern world. when I got arrested 20 years ago, nobody introduced me to a job.
Yeah,
I got introduced to
yeah,
the magistrates. So
exactly.
we don't live in a fair system.
You don't go to jail and end up being a captain in the army.
No, no. And I think that's what's missing from the world today.
Exactly. Yeah.
A little breach of the peace and a job offer. It sounds great.
Exactly. Exactly. You're a nice chap, you know.
Yeah, that's right. Let me offer you a job. There's been a severe misunderstanding, and we accept your apology.
Yeah. It's often said that these circles were very nepotistic, but I have been reminded in a recent lecture by someone here in Madrid that the word nepotism didn't exist until about the next century. So these were all concentric circles of family and friends that all worked together. And the brilliance of Jose de Galvez as minister is that he did appoint people close to him, but they were all very efficient, executive, and aggressive.
With this, because this is the thing, isn't it? That I'm going to go off on a tangent slightly, but I remember watching this French documentary about the European Union some 20 odd years ago, and they were talking about border controls and one of the problems with boundaries and stuff like that. And he said the problem that the European Union had is, he said, the same problem that every country has. The experts in security were private contractors. He said,
yes.
So the private contractors come in and advise you.
Yeah.
And then they're like, well, who are the people available in Europe to do this? And all the private contractors are like, we are. And they said, he said, the system ends up can be seen to be corrupt. But the fact of the matter is, the very people who you needed to advise you were actually the only people that could help you. And so if you've got these small circles in Spain, in any country, where you meet intelligent young men who have something about them, whether they're just a bit flamboyant, can convince, can have a talk, but then show themselves to actually be effective at work.
Yes, and in the UK, this is the interesting part. Regiments were raised by regimental colonels who were either nobles or extremely wealthy people that got the commission to raise an army for the king, to raise a regiment, and they would be local regiments, and they would raise them near their estates or whatever. And equally, the example in the Navy is that they fought for their seamates on their ships, but they fought for money. Every time a ship was captured, the admiral got a cut, and the group got a cut. So they were fighting for money and the king, in the background. But right in front of them, the Royal Navy was the most aggressive because it had the most clear-cut rules as to prize money.
So and this is like you say, it's incentives. If we win, we share the spoils.
It was the bonus. Yeah. The bonus.
Yeah, and so what happens next then?
So during the Yorktown campaign, the result of the Yorktown campaign and the British loss there leads the British Parliament to vote out the Prime Minister, Lord North, and the incoming administration declares that they no longer want to pursue the war in North America. That does not mean that there's an immediate peace, but it means the British are not going to send fleets and armies to reinforce. So the North American theatre goes into minor skirmishes, but nothing serious. It's kind of a long weekend for about a year and a half, whereby the British decide that they're going to concentrate somewhere else. Because while they've been distracted in North America, France and Spain have decided they're going to have a crack at taking the main British island in the Caribbean, Jamaica. And Jamaica not only had a hugely valuable sugar industry, there was the Jamaica lobby in Parliament. So the Royal Navy is then tasked with essentially leaving the garrison towns in North America, essentially with skeleton blockade, but really they reman and send a large fleet, the biggest fleet that they'd accumulated, down to the Caribbean to ward off the next campaign of the Spanish and the French. And this was part of what I was referring to in the de Grasse-Saavedra Convention. Part of the agreement was that after campaigning in North America, de Grasse would go back to the Caribbean and join with the Spanish to take Jamaica. And this is, by that stage, has become well known in England. And so the British rally, they send a huge fleet to try and intercept this French plan. And in April 1782, about 6 months after Yorktown, there's a huge battle, bigger than Trafalgar, called the Battle of the Saints. The Battle of the Saints involves Britain's most aggressive Admiral Rodney, and de Grasse, who has been campaigning for almost a year in the Caribbean and North America. De Grasse is coming to join up with the Spanish on Saint-Domingue to gather a huge army and to join his fleet up with another 11 Spanish ships to the line. And they would have probably something like joined together 45 to almost 50 ships to the line. However, this joining up never happens. The British send 36 ships to the line under Admiral Rodney. All of them have just been serviced. They're fresh crews. They're coming straight out from North America, or most of them are. And there's a huge battle at the Battle of the Saints, which de Grasse loses. De Grasse is captured. The French fleet, although not crippled, loses around 7 ships. But it's enough of a shock to the French naval officers who, having lost their commander, they lose the impetus to carry on the invasion of Jamaica. So there's a huge effect on the morale of the Spanish and the French who are waiting for de Grasse to arrive on Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue is only about 2 days' sail westwards with the prevailing winds to Jamaica. So that's why they were gathering there. So when the French fleet is broken up and the admiral captured, they decide they're going to wait and see what the courts in France and Spain say. So Saavedra, being the royal commissioner, volunteers, and he is voted by all the army and admirals, all the generals and admirals on Saint-Domingue to go back to France. So he goes back to France and advises the French court. And this is when he starts to go up and become a really interesting personality, because by that time, the aid he's been providing to the French is well known in the court. And he meets the French king, Louis XVI. He has meetings with all his ministers, the foreign minister Vergennes, the minister of the navy, Castries, who then entrust him with taking all the updated plans to Madrid. He goes overland to Madrid. Saavedra arrives in Madrid in June 1782, and they start making plans again for Jamaica to send out a huge fleet of maybe 40, 50 ships and a huge army. So what this plan eventually becomes, because it doesn't actually take place, is the main threat for the British to become interested in suing for a peace, because the war's getting out of hand. It's costing everybody a ton of money, and everybody wants an honorable end. This campaign against Jamaica is put on ice for the summer of 1782, because the Spanish and the French come up with a very intelligent, they think, plan to take Gibraltar. But unfortunately, the British garrison proves to be too strong. The French invent what they call the floating batteries, which were water-cooled, and with pumps, they would pump water between the cladding of the wood. So, because the British would fire shot which had been heated, it was called red shot, Yes. So these cannonballs would embed themselves and set fire to anything. So the Spanish and French think they've got these floating batteries, which are, because of they got water pumping between the planks, No, but they all get blown up in one night. It's all a huge, it's all a huge disaster. And so back to Plan B. Okay, the main threat against Britain is going to continue to be the invasion of Jamaica. So a huge fleet is actually gathered in Cadiz that will depart in the beginning of the following year, 1783. But over those few months, all sides agree to a peace treaty, which was complicated because there was a lot of horse trading with the islands and territories that had been taken. The Spanish still wanted Gibraltar. They'd just taken Minorca from the British. The French were backwards and forwards with some of the islands they had taken in the Caribbean, like St. Lucia. So all this horse trading takes place. But the big detonator for everyone, for the Spanish and the French particularly, is that the Americans weren't supposed to do it because they were all going to be on the same side. But in late November 1782, the Americans sign a peace with the British. So what that means is France and Spain are the only ones left in the war. And if the North Americans are no longer a threat to Britain, they're going to have to take British wrath, on their own. So they all come to an agreement, settle which territories is whose, and a preliminary peace is signed in end of January 1783, with the final treaty, the Treaty of Paris, signed in September 1783. But no fighting actually takes place during 1783. There are some actions actually far away in India between a small French fleet and English fleet, which the British lose out of, but because news takes 6 to 9 months to come back, even though the French have taken some territory off the British, it arrives too late, and the peace deal is being made, and sort of nothing comes of that.
Yeah.
So the British are left intact with what they have in India.
So what happens to Francisco then?
So he then goes back to Madrid and gets elevated. He'd been an army captain, slightly unemployed, found his job at the secretary's position in the Ministry of the Indies, gets sent out as Royal Commissioner. He gets a medal. He gets the Grand Cross of Carlos III and is well recognized in court because his task has been to put generals that would never cooperate amongst themselves on the Spanish side, and the Spanish side would never cooperate with the French side. And he's kind of magically smoothed everybody together. And you can imagine nowadays, generals don't get on all the time. Well, in those times, when letters took 3 to 6 months to get backwards and forth, it was a recipe for chaos. So Saavedra is the balm that sort of puts everything together. So he gets a good job after this. He gets sent out to Venezuela to become intendant of Caracas, which Caracas was the name for Greater Venezuela at the time. The intendant is actually like a finance minister and development minister at the same time. So he's the main guy in Venezuela for about 4 years until he comes back when the two Galvez friends that he had, his minister boss and his friend Bernardo, they both die in 1787, 1788, and Saavedra goes back to Madrid. And just after he comes back, he gets elevated because Carlos III has died also in 1789. His son, Carlos IV, comes in and awards Saavedra with a job in the Council of War, which is an advisory council. So what happens in the next few years is the French Revolutionary Wars explode and France and Spain become enemies. It's no longer your French Bourbon family dynasty on the north side of the border. So Spain flip-flops between being with the British, but being invaded by the French, who are now enemies. And there's a lot of chaos. When they join the French in around 1796, the British cut off the silver that can come across the sea from South America. So Spanish finances go down the drain hole. So there's huge amount of chaos in the court at the time. Saavedra gets made finance minister briefly and also prime minister during this time. But one of the elements within the court, which was very unstable, the son, Carlos IV, was a disastrous king to Spain. Unlike his father, who had brought 20 plus years of stability and good governance to Spain, the son was an absolute disaster. His wife was said, and historians can't prove, but it's generally acknowledged, that one of the aide-de-camp, one of the young army officers, Godoy, was the Queen's lover. So he's an intriguer in the court, and he's a young intriguer. His camp is accused of poisoning Saavedra, and Saavedra has to leave the court for a few years. And so he goes and retires back to Seville eventually. And he's there in 1808. So fast forward, the revolution has expired, and Napoleon is now in place, creating all sorts of havoc in Europe from the 1798, 1799. Napoleon invades Spain in 1808. So Saavedra's sitting at home in Seville, and Napoleon has taken Madrid, and his armies are marching down to take the southern part of Spain. And the mob and the local elite go to his house and demand that he becomes the leader of the Seville Council. And by that stage, he's been weakened by this poisoning, so he's not well. But he's an expert and master of logistics. He's done it in the Caribbean. He puts together an army from a local army detachment. It was around 12,000 men, which was near Gibraltar. And then a huge amount of volunteers join up to make an army around 30,000 men, which go and meet this French army in a battle called the Battle of Bailén. Battle of Bailén is the first time a Napoleonic army is beaten in an open battle in Europe. So Saavedra puts together this army, and other battles happen, and the French double up, and Napoleon himself comes and takes over from his generals. But also during this time, the Duke of Wellington arrives to help the Spanish. So these are the Peninsular Wars with the Duke of Wellington. It takes 5 years to boot the French out, but eventually they are thrown out, and Saavedra finally does retire to Seville. He's now in his late 60s, and which is where he passes away in 1890.
Wow. That's a life, isn't it? I mean, it sounds glorious, but it's probably horrible. He's probably lived an awful time.
I think his greatest achievements and the greatest times were under Carlos III, who was a magnificent king who built up Spain. The economy was expanding. Everything was on a sound footing. After the American War of Independence, Spanish commerce with its colonies was liberalized and was making all the colonies a lot richer. So he was a very talented administrator, was very proud of what he'd done in South America. But unfortunately, with the new king, who only went hunting and didn't really care about the economy or anything else, chaos ensued during the Revolutionary Wars and during the Napoleonic Wars. So it must have been a very sad time. Funnily enough, in his memoirs, he doesn't even mention the Battle of Trafalgar, which was during this period in which the Spanish fleet was completely eliminated, which made it very difficult for Spain to deal with the independence movements in Latin America, which started as a result of the beheading of the Spanish monarchy by Napoleon and the cutting off of Spain from its colonies. All the independence movements started at that time, and it took about 15 years for the final independence in Mexico, the final colony, to go. So Spain actually just went down the proverbial during this time, and never really recovered until 1986 when it joined the EU.
It's amazing. That's an amazing story. Just a couple of things before we go. Where can people find you in your book?
So my book is available on Amazon, in any of the marketplaces, amazon.com, .co.uk, .es. It's all available in bookshops, through Barnes & Noble and other retailers, particularly in North America, because the other distributor is Ingram Spark, which distributes to shops. So it's available in both marketplaces and also as an ebook. In both of those websites, Amazon and Ingram Spark.
And where can people find you?
My website is jamesgiesler.com. And again, the book, I'll remind everybody, Francisco de Saavedra's American Revolutionary War, subtitle, The Spanish Contribution to the Battle of Yorktown.
And just lastly, my random question. I want you to imagine you have a time machine. The time machine is a car of your choice. What car would it be? Where would you go? And what would you have playing on the radio?
Well, that would be quite an interesting one. I would probably have a Citroën DS, from the 1970s.
Yep.
And I would be probably traveling down somewhere in southern France listening to some lovely French music.
And would that be in the 70s?
1970s, yes.
James, that's perfect. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, David.
And that was James and myself talking. And it's one of the reasons it frustrates me that we don't discuss history enough. We don't teach it enough in schools. Because everybody's history, from Europe to the Americas, it's so rich and so entwined that it should almost be a lifelong learning. But certainly within schools, no child should ever leave school without a basic knowledge of their history. And as James rightly pointed out as we were talking, just how entwined the many countries are, the politics, the money, and those are important lessons, and we shouldn't forget them. And as always, thank you to everybody that watches, that listens, that shares, comments. And wherever you are from, whatever you believe, please do take care and be blessed. Thank you.